Why would anyone plant pineapples in the Sahel, where winds howl, sand devours roots, and water vanishes before it even touches the earth? Captain Ibrahim Traoré dared to dream of sweetness. Not just fruit, not just exports, but defiance in the face of drought, sovereignty grown leaf by spiky leaf. At dawn, the radios crackled across Burkina Faso, "Plant 100 million pineapples." Some laughed. Others gasped. Many thought it was madness. But Traoré saw what others could not, a wall of sweetness that would shield a nation from erasure. This wasn't farming. This was a national resurrection. Stay with us, not just for the harvest, but for the hope. Subscribe now and plant your name beside ours in this vineyard of sovereignty. Burkina Faso is not waiting, it's rising. It began with a voice, steady, firm, and unmistakably his. At first light, radios across Burkina Faso came alive with the morning bulletin. But this was no ordinary government update. It was an order, a call, a command that left villagers frozen in disbelief. Every province, every village, every household, plant pineapples. 100 million. No preamble, no explanation. Just the raw audacity of numbers that felt too large to hold. Grapes, they remembered. Dragon fruit, they still whispered about. But pineapples? Across the Sahel? That brittle no-man's land between sand and savanna? It sounded impossible. And that's exactly why Captain Ibrahim Traoré gave the order. For decades, the desert had claimed more than land. It claimed futures, families, and pride. From Goram to Dori, people watched their soil die inch by inch. Millet failed. Goats starved. Trees disappeared. And aid, always aid, came late, came tied with strings, and came dripping with condescension. But Traoré had no intention of watching another year pass in silence. We do not plant to beg. We plant to break the cycle. Why pineapples? Why now? Because pineapples were fighters. In regions from Ghana to Côte d'Ivoire, they thrived where others faltered. Their spiky leaves trapped moisture. Their shallow roots held soil against erosion. Their thick skins resisted pests and heat. They could be grown with minimal water on degraded land and matured in just 18 months. It wasn't just fruit. It was strategy. And Traoré saw beyond the field. Ecologically, pineapples would stitch a green seam across Burkina Faso's waistline, slowing the desert's crawl. Nutritionally, they were rich in vitamins, sweet, fresh, and life-giving in malnourished communities. Economically, global pineapple exports were worth over $2 billion annually. Burkina Faso, long dependent on cotton and gold, could now pivot to fruit. And symbolically, the pineapple was a crown, a golden fruit born from cracked soil. Resilience, sweetness, sovereignty. Traoré made the announcement not from a palace but from a nursery, standing barefoot in the dust, holding a sucker in his hand. His speech was short, almost whispered. This is not a fruit. This is a frontier, a line we draw, not in ink, but in life. From this day, the desert will have to fight for every grain it takes. Immediately, the machinery of the state turned. Helicopters airlifted suckers from coastal partners. The army laid irrigation lines and dug planting trenches. Radio stations broadcast the Pineapple War. Children memorized poems about fruit and freedom. Women's cooperatives received microgrants to run local nurseries. Agricultural universities trained field brigades in planting technique. Youth brigades, once adrift, now marched, not with rifles but with shovels. Even the elderly, who had seen too many failed schemes, found themselves asking quietly, could it be done? In markets, pineapple suckers sold out. In churches and mosques, prayers were said for roots to hold. Traoré's cabinet ministers planted alongside school children, cameras rolling. It wasn't just policy. It was performance, a ritual, a resurrection. Some called it madness. Western newspapers dismissed it as pineapple populism. Foreign agronomists scoffed, that soil is dead. But the people, tired of waiting, tired of doubting, picked up hoes and began to dig. They planted not because they were sure, but because they had been dared. Across the frontier from Dori to Djibo, rows of green began to appear, spiky, defiant, and fragile. Each crown stood like a soldier at attention, guarding the border not with bullets, but with leaves. They called it the Wall of Sweetness. It was too soon to call it a success. The rains had yet to fall. The heat had yet to test their resolve. But something had shifted. Where there had been despair, now stood defiance. And so the world watched, silently, skeptically. Could 100 million pineapples really tame the desert? And if they failed, what then? The desert struck back almost instantly. No sooner had the first million crowns touched soil than the Sahel reminded everyone why it was feared. Sandstorms rolled in like biblical punishment, burying thousands of seedlings beneath waves of grit. What the army had planted in daylight, the wind erased by nightfall. In the village of Tinikoff, children cried as their parents clawed through dunes, searching for green tips poking through the earth. In Gorom, goats chewed through entire rows of pineapple crowns before fences could be built. And in Dori, the sun cracked irrigation lines and boiled water before it reached the roots. Critics pounced. Foreign observers sent back grim forecasts. Western tabloids headlined, "Burkina's Pineapple Mirage." One French commentator sneered, "You cannot feed hope to hungry children." The laughter returned. The same smirks that met Traoré's grape campaign. The same headlines that mocked dragon fruit as desert delusion. But this time, something had changed. Because this time, the people fought back. Radio stations across the country dropped regular programming and aired a 48-hour marathon titled "Dig the Fruit." Defy the fate. Listeners called in live from fields. One elderly farmer in Seba declared, "Let the desert bury us." But not without a fight. Traoré responded not with anger, but with movement. He flew to the hardest hit zones. In Gorgaji, state TV captured him kneeling in the dust, his tunic soaked in sweat, gently brushing sand off a buried seedling. Behind him, a battalion of youth in green uniforms began uncovering plants line by line. They called themselves the Sons of Soil. Theatrics? Maybe. But they worked. Doubt turned into determination. Ministers followed suit. Celebrities posted pineapple emojis and photos from their own tiny plots. Even school children were mobilized, not as laborers but as storytellers. They wrote poems about roots that held ground, songs about sweetness growing from sorrow, short films that showed mothers defending their crops from dust with shawls and prayer. Traoré weaponized imagination. Every failure became a stage. Every dead plant became a lesson in resilience. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, belief began to bloom. In the town of Marcoye, one woman's cooperative refused to replant after the first die-off. "Too tired," they said. "Too dry." But then a 9-year-old girl from the village brought them a single sucker she'd hidden in a pot by the fire. "Let's plant just one," she whispered. That one sucker sparked a second try. Across the Sahel, stories like that took root. Small at first, quiet, but undeniable. And then came the moment that changed everything. A boy in Kautougou ran into his village holding something gold and green. He didn't shout. He didn't speak. He just lifted it high, 2 small hands wrapped around a jagged crown. The first pineapple, in the Sahel. Within hours, phones buzzed across the country. Images spread on WhatsApp, TikTok, Twitter. The fruit is real. The crown stands. Sweetness from the sand. In Ouagadougou, a spontaneous parade broke out. Women wore yellow dresses. Children painted pineapples on their cheeks. A vendor sold slices for 5 times the normal price, not out of greed but pride. Western media had no choice but to take note. CNN ran a segment, "Pineapples in the Dust, the Sahel's Surprising Harvest." The BBC featured a Burkina Faso poet who read, "We did not ask for miracles. We planted them." For the first time, the world stopped laughing. And inside Burkina Faso, the laughter turned to singing. Not all fields succeeded. Not all plants survived. But what bloomed was bigger than fruit. Belief. And then, in a patch of land just south of the frontier, where sand still licked the edges of every furrow, a cluster of gold began to rise. 10, 20, then hundreds. Small, thorny, imperfect, but unmistakable. The first harvest had begun. The pineapples didn't just feed mouths. They fed identity. In towns once defined by drought, now the air carried the scent of sweetness. In schools, children didn't just recite multiplication tables, they learned how to plant, mulch, and harvest. In markets, the stalls that once sold millet and despair now overflowed with fruit and pride. A silent revolution had taken root. By the second season, survival rates of pineapple crops climbed above 40%. Women's cooperatives ran drying racks for fruit, labeling them with handwritten tags. Burkina Gold, born from sand. Youth groups launched juice carts on street corners in Bobo Dioulasso. Even inmates in rural prisons were trained in pineapple farming as part of rehabilitation programs. And in a move no one predicted, Burkinabe fashion changed. Pineapple motifs appeared on dresses, headscarves, and even army uniforms. What began as a joke, a meme, had become a symbol. The pineapple was now a flag. Economically, the effect rippled. In just 2 years, juice factories were commissioned in Ouahigouya and Gaoua. Exports of dried pineapple snacks reached Dakar and Abidjan. Diaspora markets in Paris and New York started requesting desert fruit. Traoré moved fast to protect this momentum from the jaws of globalization. "We will not let sweetness become slavery," he declared, refusing multiple billion-dollar contracts from multinationals seeking exclusive rights. Instead, he passed a decree: pineapple cooperatives must remain locally owned. All export contracts must pass through a state-backed farmers' union. The profits would be reinvested in irrigation, training, and processing tech. The West called him protectionist. The people called him protector. And as pineapple profits climbed, so did Traoré's approval. Opposition figures, once skeptical, were forced to pivot. Even foreign diplomats began to change their tone. Suddenly, what was once mocked as populist farming was recast in think tanks as resilient climate economics. But Traoré wasn't just winning headlines. He was rewriting the playbook of African leadership. He visited Ghana, Niger, and Mali with crates of pineapple suckers as gifts. He proposed a Sahelian pineapple corridor, a green band of fruit-bearing resilience across the continent's most fragile land. And then came the moment that solidified the movement, not just as agriculture, but as doctrine. At the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, Traoré stood before the assembly. He held a single pineapple above his head, its golden body gleaming under the lights. Silence fell. "This," he said, "is not a fruit. This is Africa's answer to dependency. This is Africa feeding itself, defending itself, and defining itself." The hall erupted. From that day forward, pineapple cultivation became more than policy. It became Pan-African poetry. Mali launched Fields of Fire along its northern border. Senegal integrated pineapples into its coastal defense projects. Even Ethiopia began testing Sahelian-adapted hybrids on dry plateaus. Traoré had done what few had achieved. He had taken fruit and turned it into a movement. At home, the pineapple harvests weren't perfect. Pests still came. Water shortages persisted. But something more powerful had been harvested: dignity. And in a world where Africa was too often only seen through the lens of need, Traoré had forced the world to watch resilience take root. The world had scoffed. Now it stared. What began as whispers of madness in Western media had grown into headlines of marvel. "Pineapples versus the Sahara," read the cover of The Economist. National Geographic dispatched a crew to document what they called the world's most unlikely orchard. In Brussels, diplomats scrambled to rewrite their Africa memos. But in Burkina Faso, the people didn't wait for validation. They painted murals of crowned pineapples shielding villages from sand. They sang songs like "Fruit of Our Fathers" and "The Crown in the Dust." Children dressed as pineapples in school plays. One child, playing the desert, dramatically surrendered to a vine in a burst of applause. Culture had absorbed the crop. And culture, unlike crops, cannot be uprooted. From postage stamps to national banknotes, the pineapple appeared everywhere. Designers launched fashion lines titled "Sweet Sovereignty." Even the military adopted the term "ananas armé," not mocking but proud. The wall of sweetness was no longer just a planting zone. It was a mental frontier, a boundary between what Africa was told it couldn't do and what it did anyway. Meanwhile, the West struggled to respond. Exporters in Costa Rica and the Philippines, once untouchable in the global pineapple trade, suddenly faced unexpected competition. Lobbyists in Europe demanded tariffs, but African markets pushed back. Asia, in contrast, welcomed the fruit. Japan branded it Sahel Gold, and luxury grocers in Seoul marketed it as a resilience fruit. Singaporean chefs featured it in high-end restaurants under the name Desert Jewel. And then came the wine. It wasn't perfect. Not yet. But it was real. Vin du Sahel, a dry, citrus-forward pineapple wine, was unveiled at a live national broadcast. Traoré stood in a field surrounded by farmers. He poured the wine into a glass. He swirled it. He sipped. And then, lifting it to the camera, he spoke. They said we could only drink sorrow. Now we toast with sweetness. From the land they called dead, we bottled dignity. Social media exploded. Pineapple wine trended globally. African-American communities in the diaspora flooded Burkina Faso consulates with inquiries about importing. But this was more than branding. It was geopolitical theater. For decades, African nations had been trapped in a triangle of dependency: aid, debt, and imported goods. Now, one of the continent's poorest countries had flipped the script with fruit. Development agencies, once dismissive, raced to attach their logos to the project. They published glowing case studies. They invited Traoré to keynote climate summits. But he remained defiant. You ignored us when we begged. Don't follow us now that we've grown. In Addis Ababa, at a second AU session, he made it plain. Holding a bottle of pineapple wine in one hand and a sucker in the other, he said, "This is our future. Not written in sand, but carved in sweetness." And behind him, on giant screens, rolled drone footage of the wall of sweetness, kilometers of green. By the 5th year, there was no denying it. The gamble had grown into a harvest. And the harvest had become a legacy. Across the Sahelian belt, where maps once painted only sand and suffering, there now ran wide corridors of green, not lush jungles, not miracle forests, but stubborn rows of pineapple crowns, defiant, sharp, sun-drenched. They had held the line. The desert hadn't disappeared, but it had stopped advancing. And for Burkina Faso, that alone was a triumph history would remember. Economically, the numbers were staggering. 30,000 plus direct jobs, over $200 million in annual pineapple exports, juice factories in Ouagadougou, Bobo Dioulasso, and Kaya, dried fruit brands on shelves from Nairobi to Dubai. Vin du Sahel featured in international trade fairs and high-end African restaurants, but numbers only told part of the story. The deeper victory was psychological. A generation of Burkina Faso children had grown up planting sweetness instead of burying hope. They didn't fear the land. They worked it. They sang to it. They told stories about it. They belonged to it. Where once farmers waited for foreign aid, now they organized to expand production. Women who had stood in food lines now stood before investor panels, pitching pineapple cooperatives. Youth who had dreamt of fleeing to Europe now dreamed of franchising juice stalls in Côte d'Ivoire. A nation had reimagined itself. And Traoré, he had become more than president. He was a symbol, not a saint. Critics still accused him of centralizing too much power, of silencing opposition, of bending law to ambition. But even his critics whispered one truth. He made the desert blink. And that wasn't just strategy. That was vision. He didn't just plant crops. He planted possibility. At his final address to the parliament before stepping down, Traoré stood before a chamber packed with farmers, youth, poets, generals, and journalists. He wore no military uniform, no sash, just a simple tunic stained with dust from the fields. In one hand, he held a single pineapple. In the other, a worn-out shovel. We were told to accept the sand, but we dared to dig. We were told to beg for aid, but we planted sweetness. And now the world drinks our story, not in pity, but in praise. Silence fell, then thunderous applause. And across the country, from the northernmost border to the southern green valleys, people raised pineapples, real or carved, fresh or wooden, toward the sky. What began as a gamble had become a gospel. Burkina Faso had written a new chapter in Africa's book, one not of famine, but of fruit. And as the sun dipped below the dunes, casting long shadows across the pineapple fields, a new generation whispered the words they had grown up with. We will plant sweetness until even the sand surrenders.